August 2009, a quiet suburb outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. A fitness center. An aerobics class was in session. The music was playing. Women were moving to the music. Everything felt normal until the lights went out. And then the gunfire started. George Sodini, a 48-year-old systems analyst, walked calmly into that room, turned out the lights, and opened fire. That day, he murdered 3 women and injured 9 others before turning the gun on himself. The country was horrified. News outlets covered the tragedy. Photos of smiling victims were shared around. And the gunman's name was spoken with disgust. But behind that one night of violence was a far longer story, one that has quiet desperation at its root, of emotional starvation, of years spent in the shadows, unseen, unheard, and unraveling. Because what made George Sodini so chilling wasn't just the act of violence that he perpetrated. It was the calm and calculated silence that preceded it. And the journal that he left behind, that he posted online for anyone to read, revealed what society missed. Now, as a man who didn't know how to talk about his pain, so his pain spoke for him. It spoke loudly and violently and tragically. George Sodini looked like a lot of men that you pass by on the street. He was clean cut, he was professional, he was mild-mannered, he worked in IT, he owned a house, he went to the gym, he wore button-down shirts, he wasn't a loser in the classic sense. He had coworkers, neighbors, and routines in life. But beneath the surface, he was crumbling. In his online journal, which he uploaded for months leading up to the shooting, he detailed a life of almost unbearable emotional pain. He wrote obsessively about his inability to attract women, about how he hadn't had sex in over 2 decades, about how he believed he would never be desired. Entry after entry, he painted a portrait of someone lost in the pain of being unchosen. But what's most haunting isn't just the content, but its tone. See, Sodini didn't sound angry. He sounded resigned, as if he'd already decided he didn't belong in this world, as if he had been trying quietly for decades, and he finally just gave up. That's the tragedy we're here to talk about today. Because when we think about mass violence, we often picture rage. We picture explosions of emotion and hatred that's just spilling out. But sometimes, the most dangerous pain is the pain that makes no noise. The kind that simmers beneath polite smiles. The kind that journals instead of rants. The kind that sits in church pews and goes to work and nods through small talk, while quietly deciding that the world has no place for them. That's what George Sodini represents. Not just an act of horror, but a slow and quiet erosion of hope. In one of his journal entries, Sodini wrote, "Women just don't like me. There is nothing inherently wrong with me and the way I look or behave. I see other men with women and I just don't understand. Like, what do they have that I don't?" This wasn't a man looking for domination. This was a man begging quietly to be seen. He studied self-help books. He attended seminars. He even tried going to a church group. But over and over, he came to the same conclusion. And that was, I will never be wanted. And that belief it hardened over time. It became an identity. It became evidence. It became fuel until he wasn't just lonely. He was convinced that life itself had rejected him. So let's pause here a quick moment, because this is where so many people ask the wrong question. They ask, why didn't he just try harder? But that question assumes something quite dangerous. It assumes that people like Sodini haven't already been trying for years, trying to smile, trying to fit in, trying to date, trying to matter. But when all of that effort meets silence or rejection or even indifference, the human spirit begins to fracture. And if there's no one to speak into that fracture, to call it what it is, to offer intimacy, to name the shame, then the silence becomes a strategy. And so you stop trying. You stop reaching out. You stop listening to the voice that says, you were never meant to belong. And that's how loneliness becomes lethal. You see, George Sodini's story is not about what he did. More so, it's about what he believed. And what he believed is disturbingly common among many men today. That if they are not chosen, they are not worthy. That if they are not sexually desired, they are invisible. That if they don't receive love, they've done something to deserve the absence of it. These are the lies that fester in silence. And silence is exactly what surrounds men like Sodini, until the day that it explodes. But here's the most sobering part of this. The people around him did not see it coming. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't explosive. He didn't post threats. He didn't shout in public. He just smiled. He went to work. He went home. He wrote in a journal that no one knew existed. And this is why the myth of obvious danger is so dangerous, because it keeps us from seeing the real warning signs, those warning signs of withdrawal, the warning signs of isolation, of hopelessness that's disguised as routine, politeness that's used to mask despair. You see, George Sodini did not snap. He slipped deeper and deeper into a worldview that made violence feel like the only form of proof that he mattered. So let's go a little deeper into the emotional terrain of George Sodini's life. Because what made his story so haunting wasn't just the ending. It was a quiet buildup, the way that he moved through the world like a ghost in his own life, seen by others but not truly known by anyone. His journal wasn't full of hatred. It was full of helplessness. He didn't talk about revenge fantasies in every entry. He talked about hope over and over in different ways. He asked the world, could someone love me? He chronicled his trips to the gym, his careful grooming habits, his attempts to dress well. He read dating books. He watched self-help videos. He went to personal development seminars. He even documented how he tried to strike up small conversations with women, only to be ignored or brushed off. And with every failure, he added a layer to his story. I was right, he said. I will never be enough. And this is what shame does. It collects the data, and then it calls it truth. It makes rejection feel like a report card, and it turns isolation into one's identity. And once that identity hardens, it's almost impossible to imagine another way of being. And this is where we need to pause again, not to sympathize with the actions, but to recognize the pattern at play. Because Sodini isn't just one man, he's a mirror. His story echoes the quiet torment of thousands, maybe millions of men who have never learned how to express vulnerability without fear of being ridiculed. Men who were taught to strive and to succeed and to conquer, but never how to sit in the mess of longing without the shame. And here's the thing, many of these men are trying to show up, trying to become the version of themselves that someone might finally choose. But when every effort is met with indifference, or worse, contempt, they don't just feel discouraged, they feel condemned. That's when despair becomes deadly. Not always in the form of mass violence. Sometimes it's depression. Sometimes it's suicide. Sometimes it's addiction. Sometimes it's radicalization. But always, it starts with this silent belief that I am fundamentally unlovable. One of the most revealing parts of Sodini's writing is the way he talked about his attempts to connect. You see, he would say things like, I looked at her and smiled, but she looked away. I went, he said, to a church event, and no one spoke to me. I walked past women at the mall, and none of them glanced at me. And to an outsider, these might seem like small moments. But to someone who is drowning in loneliness, every interaction becomes a referendum on one's worth. And the silence of others becomes the loudest answer of all. And that's the tragedy. Sodini wasn't angry at specific people. He was devastated by the absence of people in his life. He interpreted invisibility as an indictment. And invisibility is one of the most painful forms of rejection that there is. Because when people hate you, at least they acknowledge your existence, right? But when people ignore you, you start to question if you're even real at all. We often hear the phrase attention seeking as a critique. But let's flip it. What if attention isn't a selfish cry? What if attention is instead a survival instinct? People need to be noticed to feel human. They need to be smiled at. They need to be spoken to. They need to be affirmed. And when that doesn't happen, they don't just feel lonely, they actually feel erased. And in Sodini's case, that sense of erasing became intolerable. And so he made a plan, a horrific, devastating plan. A plan not to lash out, but to prove that he existed. And this is how quiet pain turns catastrophic. Not because people snap, but because they can't bear another year of being no one. And what did he choose as his final act? He didn't lash out at his workplace. He didn't target people that he knew. He instead went to a fitness class, a room full of women he had never spoken to. And why was that? I think it's because that room represented everything that he felt denied. He felt denied joy and community and confidence, visibility, touch. And in his distorted mind, he saw it as a place where his worth had been declared null. And so he turned it into a battlefield. Not because he hated those women individually, but more so because he believed that their indifference proved his insignificance. And that's how dangerous, unspoken pain can become intolerable. It stops making distinctions. It stops humanizing others around you. It in essence collapses everything into a single devastating belief, and that is, if I can't be wanted, then someone has to pay. It's easy to recoil at that logic, and we should. It's not okay. It's not defensible, but it's also not incomprehensible either. Because if we don't take the time to understand where this kind of thinking starts, we will never prevent where it ends. And it doesn't always end in blood. Sometimes it just ends in men going to their graves, never having been held, never having been known, never having felt safe enough to say that I'm not okay. George Sodini never said those words out loud that we know. He most likely only whispered them in his journal. And when no one answered, the silence that he was in became a scream. So let's talk a little bit about the myth of male composure. The idea that men should be stoic or unaffected or self-contained or emotionally bulletproof. You see, this myth doesn't just shape how boys are raised. It shapes what men believe that they're allowed to feel. George Sodini was not loud. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't rage on forums or threaten others on social media. Instead, he did what countless of men are silently taught to do. He internalized everything. He internalized his sadness, his sexual frustration, his envy, his shame. He folded it all inward and pretended that everything was fine until it wasn't. And when no one asked those deeper questions, when no one challenged the performance, or when no one noticed the signs, his pain metastasized into silence. And this is why emotional fluency isn't just a luxury, it's actually a lifeline. If men aren't taught to name what they're feeling, those feelings don't just disappear, they mutate. The sadness becomes sarcasm. The shame becomes withdrawal. The loneliness becomes bitterness. And the hurt becomes blame. And over time, the man smiling at your family reunion, or who's nodding through team meetings, could be carrying this level of torment that no one suspects until it cracks. And Sodini's journal was filled with these silent mutations. He never screamed at women. He didn't stalk or threaten anyone. He just silently dissolved. And that's what makes this kind of pain so easy to overlook and so deadly to ignore. See, in the months leading up to the shooting, Sodini had stopped trying. His journal turned darker and more fatalistic. He talked about having tried everything, about how nothing changed, about how it wasn't worth it anymore. And he fixated on couples that he saw in public who were holding hands and laughing and having a good time. He called them the chosen ones. And he wrote about how he had been condemned to watch life happen from the outside. He didn't hate love. He grieved it. Not in the poetic way that we hear in breakup songs, or the way we watch it in sad movies, but in the cold way of someone who believes that love is a language that he will never be taught. That's the kind of grief that does not cry out. It sinks in. Now, let's address something rather uncomfortable. Sodini, like many men in his position, began to adopt ideas about entitlement. He felt that he deserved intimacy, that he had earned affection through his self-improvement efforts. And this is where longing can turn toxic, when it stops being an ache and becomes instead this expectation. And this is where many incel-aligned men lose their path. Because connection, like real human connection, it's never owned. It's never something that we deserve because of effort or appearance or patience. No, this kind of connection is something that we build. And building it requires more than pickup techniques or gym routines. It requires presence. It requires openness and vulnerability and curiosity and the willingness to be seen before being impressive. But if no one teaches that, if no one models it, then longing turns into entitlement, and entitlement turns into resentment. And resentment, when starved of confrontation, it turns into a script. They're the problem, we say. They're the shallow ones. They're cruel. They're the gatekeepers of the affection that I should already be experiencing, if not having. That's the script that Sodini began to write. Not because he was evil from the start, but because he didn't know how else to make sense of being unloved. This is where integrity matters. Integrity doesn't mean stuffing down your pain and pretending you're fine. It means instead aligning your inner experience with your outer actions. It means asking, am I becoming the kind of person I would want to connect with? Am I being honest about what I need? Or am I hiding behind a mask? Am I growing in the direction of intimacy? Or am I rehearsing stories of victimhood? Sodini didn't ask those questions, and no one around him helped him to ask them. That's not a failure of individual willpower. That's a cultural failure. We do not equip men to ask these kind of questions without shame. We don't make it safe to admit, I'm starving for connection and I don't know how to get it or experience it. And instead we hand them platitudes. Be confident, we say. Hit the gym, right? Level up. Man up. Don't be so sensitive. And when those strategies don't yield intimacy, the shame just doubles up. Because now they've failed after doing what we told them to do in the first place. George Sodini didn't need a girlfriend to save him. He needed a mirror. He needed a space where he could say the unspeakable and still be seen. A friend who didn't offer fixes but asked real questions. A community that didn't laugh at his awkwardness, but instead leaned in with curiosity. He didn't need to be mocked for being cringe. Instead, he needed to be welcomed in his confusion. But instead, he was left alone in a world that told him, if you're not wanted, it's probably your fault. And that message, repeated oftentimes, becomes unbearable. So where do we go from here? We don't romanticize this man. We don't excuse what he did. We don't center his pain above his victims, but we also don't ignore the trail that led him to that room. Because every part of his story is filled with flashing warning signs that we've been conditioned to miss. Politeness without presence is one. Effort without connection, or silence that's mistaken for stability. Resignation that's mistaken for maturity. And if we don't start seeing these signs for what they are, we'll keep asking, why didn't anyone see it coming? So let's turn to that gym. The lights go off and shots are fired. 3 women are tragically killed, and 9 more are horrifically injured. George Sodini takes his own life. The world reacts the way it does. There's shock and horror and condemnation. And then silence. But buried beneath the headlines, beneath the outrage, was the truth that Sodini was trying to express all along. That even if in the most devastating way possible, he was saying, I was in pain and no one noticed. That is not an excuse. That's an indictment of all the ways we've normalized ignoring suffering when it doesn't look dramatic. Because when pain is quiet, we often assume that it's harmless. But quiet pain often is the most dangerous form of pain. It doesn't ask for help. It doesn't warn anyone. It simply builds and builds until it breaks. And this is what makes Sodini's story so important, not as a sensational tragedy, but as a case study in neglect. He was surrounded by people. He had a job, he had a gym membership, he had a church that he attended. He lived in a home that he owned. He went to events, he smiled in the photos. But no one really saw him. No one asked the deeper questions. No one challenged his isolation. And no one pulled him aside and said, hey, I'm here. You matter, even if you feel like you don't. And maybe he wouldn't have believed them, but maybe, just maybe, it would have interrupted this downward spiral. Sometimes interruption is all that it takes. So this episode isn't just about George Sodini. It's about the man that you know who reminds you of him, the coworker who never speaks up, the family member who never really shares, the neighbor who seems fine but always avoids eye contact, that online friend who makes one too many jokes about being alone forever. You see, they might not be planning violence, but they might be carrying an unbearable weight in silence. And if no one asks, if no one notices, if no one actually makes it okay to say, I'm not okay, then we're just waiting for the next crisis to hit. So what can we do? Well, let's start with presence. You don't need to be a therapist to make a difference. You just need to be available, to ask real questions, to listen without fixing, to welcome awkwardness instead of rushing past it, to see someone in their insecurity without making them feel like they're exposed. See, you don't need the perfect words. You just need to show up. Because sometimes the smallest invitation, it could be a comment, a text, a gesture, that small act can become the crack that lets light into someone's darkness. And on a broader level, we need to start telling different stories about masculinity. We need to stop pretending that male pain is dangerous just because it exists. It's dangerous because we've refused to name it. And when we shame men for being lonely, they don't become less lonely. They become better at hiding it. And when we mock emotional hunger, we don't starve the need. We just force men to feed it in secret, often in distorted ways. So we must build a culture where longing isn't emasculating, and where struggle isn't shameful, where being unchosen doesn't feel like you're unworthy. And to the men listening now, especially the ones of you who feel at the pit of your stomach and who are hearing this pain, this part is for you. If you've ever wondered if you matter, if you've ever felt like everyone else is living this life that you're watching from the outside, if you've ever gone home after a party and felt more alone than before, if you've ever believed the lie that your value is determined by who wants you sexually, or if you've ever felt like George Sodini's journal could describe your story, please hear this. You are not alone. You are not invisible. You're not cursed, and you're not broken beyond repair. What you are feeling is very real, but it doesn't have to end the way George Sodini's story did. There is another way, one that's rooted in intimacy and not in ideology, one that has presence manifested instead of performance extended, one that is honest instead of trying to be heroic. You don't have to carry this alone. You don't have to solve all of this today or tomorrow. You just have to take one small step. Tell us a truth today, even if it's awkward. Look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself a truth, even if your voice shakes while doing it, even if it makes you feel weak. Because truth, spoken aloud, is how silence begins to break. George Sodini could not do that. Or maybe he didn't believe he could. But you can. You can begin to unlearn the scripts that are so compelling in your mind. You can build friendships that don't require pretending. You can ask for help and still be worthy. You can start again. That pain to be seen is not a flaw. It's a signal. And someone, somewhere, is waiting to respond. You just have to risk letting them in. And that's what this podcast is for. Not to excuse what's inexcusable by any means of the stretch. Not to glamorize what's dangerous, but to tell the truth about pain before it festers. To name the ache before it calcifies into ideology. To offer dignity before despair becomes your identity. So let's be the people who notice, who ask the real questions, who show up even when we don't know how. Because in a world that's full of silence, even a whisper of compassion can be life-saving. So let that be the whisper together.